All right, so we're back for another reading of the Young Lords, Radical History by Johanna Fernandez. As always, we're gonna jump off with the Statement of Unity. Then we're gonna jump right into the book, and after that, have the book discussion. So I'm gonna start with my comrade Gabby, and let her start with the Statement of Unity for the Second Rainbow Coalition.
Thank you, Comrade Kwame. I'll start with the preface of the Statement of Unity. The U.S. was founded as a colonial settler state based upon white supremacy and slavery, stealing the lands of the indigenous nations, breaking every treaty made with them, and confining them to reservations, concentration camps. As the country became more powerful, the eagle sunk its claws into other nations, making war on Mexico and grabbing its northern territory, invading Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, and either annexing them outright or making them colonies or neo-colonies. And in the 20th century, it became the major imperialist power in the world, exploiting both the people within its boundaries and those in every other country, bullying them with military intervention and robbing them of their right to self-determination. As Hui Noon stated, we have two enemies to fight, racism and capitalism. Between the two, capitalism is primary. Racism is a byproduct of capitalism. By the working people of the world, of every ethnicity or nationality, face a common enemy that is destroying life on Earth. Our enemy is a small ruling class of property owners controlling most of the world's wealth and resources. We must have our basic needs met if we met to live a good and meaningful life. Food, shelter, healthcare, education, freedom from the oppression of the state, and peace with other nations. To obtain these essential things for life, we must have the power to see to it that the abundance that is available is shared equitably. Statement of Unity for the Second Rainbow Coalition. The legacy of the First Rainbow Coalition dates back to its founding on April 4th, 1969, by the original Black Panther Party, original Young Lords, and Young Patriots organization. A number of other organizations joined this coalition not too long afterwards, such as the American Indian Movement, Brown Berets, Rising Up Angry, the Red Guards, and others. Since the founding of the United States, the masses have developed a number of popular movements that came together to fight back against the capitalist imperialist system in various ways around particular demands. Nevertheless, none had established a movement quite like the First Rainbow Coalition. This historic movement was the first of its kind that established a model for class struggle like no other. Its charismatic leader, Chairman Fred Hampton of the Illinois chapter of the original Black Panther Party, stated that at the end of the day, we weren't engaged in a race struggle. He said, it's a class struggle, goddammit. By uniting with the various ethnic communities that white supremacy had long sought to keep, by uniting with the various oppressed ethnicities and masses, they were able to bridge the gap between the various ethnic communities that white supremacy had long sought to keep divided. This class solidarity equipped them with the material basis and class consciousness to see their common class condition, therefore, the necessity to form a united front against their common class oppressor, the capitalist imperialist ruling class. The ruling class viewed this as the greatest threat to their class rule, and, subsequently, used the entire repressive forces of the state, police, courts, jails, prisons, and intelligence agencies, etc., in order to crush this emerging revolutionary socialist movement. We refounded the Rainbow Coalition on May 14th, 2021, with the intent of upholding the legacy of the original Rainbow Coalition. We believe that this historic example is the model for the United Front that will best serve our class liberation. By upholding the 10-point program of the original Black Panther Party, which was subsequently adopted and later expanded by the original Young Lords, Young Patriots organization, and all other original Rainbow Coalition members, we established our pragmatic unity. The 6 disciplinary rules that we uphold ties all organizations in our coalition to a common professional discipline. History has bestowed upon our generation a common class mission to fulfill. The representatives of the capitalist imperialist ruling class, represented by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, cannot liberate us. It is their class intention and interest to uphold our common class oppression. Therefore, it is only we, the oppressed masses of all ethnicities and nationalities, who must build the necessary class solidarity, class consciousness, organizational structures, and a united front that will ultimately liberate ourselves. This is what the Second Rainbow Coalition is committed to. This is the historic mission we intend to fulfill. Dare to struggle, dare to win. All members of the coalition: New African Black Panther Party, White Panther Party, Green Party of New Jersey, Poor People's Army, La Masa Nacional de Brown Berets, NASO, North Alabama School for Organizers, New Era Young Lords, and American Indian Movement Northeast Woodland Chapter. The 6 disciplinary rules. Number 1, members will conduct themselves in a manner to bring credit to the coalition and will treat others with respect and politeness. Number 2, members will be sober when on Rainbow Coalition business and will not engage in any criminal activity. While a member. Number 3, no member will engage in violence except in the extremity of self-defense. Number 4, members will not gossip nor be divisive to the unity of the Second Rainbow Coalition. Number 5, members will not act as informers nor work against the purpose of the Second Rainbow Coalition. And number 6, nobody is authorized to speak for the Second Rainbow Coalition unless authorized to do so. And that is the statement of unity.
Appreciate that, Conrad Gabby. All right, so welcome everybody that's joined. I see a number of people. Johnny Torres. I see Kat, Alyssa, Rob. Glad to have everybody on here. We're gonna jump right into the reading, and then we'll have a discussion. So Zen, she's gonna be sharing the screen, her screen, so you can see it and follow along. I'll be reading from the book. If y'all have a book, it's on page 59. So with that, we'll start with this. The migrant.
Screen share, okay?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. And if you turn your phone, if y'all on your phone, turn it to the side, it makes it even bigger. And you can use your own hand to pinch the screen to manipulate it, make it bigger or smaller. And as individually, every one of y'all have that, can do that, and it won't manipulate that for everybody else. It'll just be your phone.
Gotcha.
All right, the Migrant Crucible. As we have seen, Puerto Ricans who came of age in the 1960s were the witnesses to one of the most complex social economic crises in their community to date. The lives of the children of the vast post-war migration developed under conditions that were qualitatively different than those of previous generations of Puerto Rican migrants, even those who came of age in the 1950s. Because the post-war migration was disproportionately younger than in previous waves, the young forged a generational identity that was made stronger by unprecedented social changes. In this sense, they share much in common with their white counterparts, the baby boomers. But while the worldview of white children had been shaped by the Cold War repression and the social sterility in suburbia, children of color were marked by their experience with the new poverty in the cities and the intensification of racial conflict with white America that emerged as a result of their exponentially greater numbers in the streets, schools, and government bureaucracies of New York. These experiences traumatized and alienated some, but gave others an organic sense of dynamics of power and inequality, fostering among them a sensitivity and a radical responsiveness to issues of social justice. During the beleaguered years of family settlement and adaptation to their new world, young Puerto Ricans were with access to language skills and a closer proximity to the new culture occupied a special space as social mediators, often called upon to help parents and neighbors navigate the inhospitable bureaucratic institutions of New York. Puerto Rican children were informal but indispensable interpreters of language and culture for hospitals to police stations, from welfare offices and banks to their own schools. In Palante, The oral history compilation of the Young Lords published after the emergence of their New York movement, Iris Morales explains that the older children and quote, older children in Puerto Rican families become the link between the Puerto Rican way of life and the American way of life, unquote. She sums up with poignancy this life on the threshold of two distinct worlds. Quote, I became the one that translated. I was the one that was the go-between, unquote. Wilfred Rojas, who joined the Young Lords in Philadelphia, describes his experience in the same terms. Quote, well, I was the go-between. Here I was a young 7, 8, 9-year-old, 14-year-old kid having to be the interpreter. There was no limited English proficiency access. I was the access. It placed a lot of responsibility because if you got the translation wrong, forget about it, unquote. Others had held even greater responsibilities, like another young Laura Carmen, who took charge of her home following her father's alcohol-fueled downward spiral. As Puerto Rican migrants witnessed the destruction of the world they knew, their children could not possibly have grasped the sheer emotional fallout of displacement. In her study of urban renewal in the post-war period, social psychiatrist Mindy Thomas Fully Love explains the displacement is perhaps the most traumatic experience that humans can undergo, with visible consequences that can last for generations. From physical and mental problems to difficulty maintaining the social fabric of a community. Fully Love identifies the symptoms of displacement as root shock, which she explains undermines trust, increases anxiety about letting loved ones out of one's sight, destabilizes relationship, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk of every kind of stress-related disease, from depression to heart attack. Root shock leaves people chronically cranky, barking a distinctive croaky complaint that their world was abruptly taken away, unquote. However, in the process of mediating between their parents and their new world, Puerto Rican children endured trauma. They also gained insight into the workings of society. That insight illuminated the ways in which class, power, and prejudice defined their treatment and condition in American society. According to Morales, she and her peers, quote, became in a sense the ones that come up against the oppression the most, unquote. As mediaries, she continued, quote, we were exposed to contradictions in the sense of how society viewed us and how we viewed ourselves, how the institutions viewed us and how we viewed ourselves, in the sense of what other people had and what we didn't, unquote. As foot soldiers in the settlement of this vast migration, these children were painfully aware of the stigma of their parents, foreign status, quote unquote, internalized a sense of inadequacy. Morales describes the shame of realizing that her parents, quote, weren't as knowledgeable as other people, unquote. In addition to bearing her own feelings of shame, she detected her mother's feelings of inadequacy in dealing with the institutions of their new society. Morales continues, quote, my mother was ashamed to go to school and talk to the teachers because she couldn't speak English and didn't look as good as the other Americans, the other mothers, unquote. The emotional fallout of this spatial cultural relocation was no less formidable for Black Americans. Momi Abu Jamal, in his memoir on the Black Panther Party, notes that many leading members of the party were children of Southern migrants who were derided as quote unquote country, quote, a connotation that has come to mean stupid, uncultured, and hickish in much of the Northern mind, unquote. As in the case of Chache Jimenez, the treatment of migrant parents as second-class citizens while their children meditated mediated on their behalf undermined the parent-child relationship. Morales explains, quote, I started blaming my parents for not giving me anything better. I started hating them, feeling that it was their fault and that if they really worked hard, they could have gotten something better, unquote. Similarly, Black Panther Assata Shakur recounts the ideological process by which, as a child, she internalized dominant concepts of the 1950s family life among middle-class white Americans that led her to judge her mother for not looking the part of the well-groomed white middle-class housewife depicted on TV. She writes, unquote, quote, why didn't we live in a house with a backyard and a front yard instead of an old apartment? I remember looking at my mother as she cleaned the house in her old raggedy house coat with her hair and curlers. How disgusting, I would think, unquote. As the dignity of adults were undermined, children had to reckon with a subtle, contradictory, and often devastating mix of emotions. Members of this generation would find in the Young Lords a cathartic forum in which to dissect and make sense of the thorny world of their childhood, which had engendered their second sight. Conversely, the painful insights these children gained as accidental intermediaries would later inform the righteous worldview of the Young Lords. Despite the burden of their role as interlocutors, their bilingual and bicultural experiences help cultivate in many of these young people a host of skills that will be essential in their organizing efforts. They gained at a very early age an analytical instinct, a great capacity for communication, and a dexterity of thought that is fostered by constantly switching between two languages, two cultures, and two worlds. The children of other migrants and immigrants in America have shared in this experience, from Italians and Eastern Europeans in the early 20th century to Nigerians and Dominicans in the late 20th century. But the experience of migrants in post-war America was simply amplified. From post-war global economic restructuring, of which Operation Bootstrap was a part, in the onset of deindustrialization to the rise of decolonialization wars and the reemergence of the civil rights movement, the daily struggles of migrant life converged with global changes of revolutionary proportions. Fueled by the era's social movements, children of migration turned their second sight into an engine for political change. Would someone like to take that from me?
I wouldn't mind it.
Okay. I see Alyssa about to say something. Let me see if Alyssa, because she ain't been on here for a minute. Would you want to read, Alyssa?
I will.
Okay, then we'll get to you, Gabby. It's been a minute since Alyssa been on here. I wanna hear your voice again.
Hell yeah, same.
All right. Well, all right. And now I feel no pressure. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. All right. The struggle to liberate education. The role of migrant children and I'm following whoever's doing the screen recording. So, the role of migrant children as cultural translators awakened in some a distinct or an instinct for social justice, but it would require a catalyst to develop fully. In New York City during the 1950s and 1960s, that catalyst was their schooling. Navigating these two realms, familial and educational, formed the emotional scaffold of their radicalization in the late 1960s. Historians have written about the fight launched by parents to desegregate public schools in New York, but we know little about its impact on the children who lived through that period of bitter contestation over the character and quality of public school education. In May of 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that racial segregation in the public schools was unconstitutional. 7 months after the Brown decision, on December 23rd, 1954, the New York Board of Education established the Commission on Integration and ordered an investigation of racial discrimination in New York schools. That commission's report, which took 4 years to complete, concluded, quote, whether school segregation is in the effect of law and custom as in the South, or has its roots in residential segregation as in New York City, its effects are inherent and incurable, unquote. Its language reflected the firestorm that the federal mandate ignited. And what is that word? Acronymous? Acro-
Acronymous, I believe.
Uh,
Acrimonious.
Yeah,
Acrimonious.
acrimonious. All right. An acrimonious contest among white teachers, Black American and Puerto Rican parents, and their white counterparts over the meaning and consequences of the Brown decision for their children. As these hostilities trickled down into the classroom, they intensified the experience of social rejection and stigmatization among Black American and Puerto Rican kids. In the 1950s and 1960s, these children came face to face with white backlash to desegregate just outside their school buildings, the racism of their teachers, and political repression of students in the schools. Combined, these experiences laid the foundation of their full-blown estrangement from the dominant institutions of society. The challenges confronting the Board of Education were also demographic and what is that?
Yeah,
What now?
pedological.
Pedagogical.
Yeah, pedagogical.
Oh.
Meaning like school, dealing with schools,
Yeah.
education.
Okay. In 1954, the board had considered negligible the very small minority of Puerto Rican students in San Juan Hill, a Manhattan neighborhood, and quote unquote Spanish Harlem. But only 4 years later, in 1954, it reported the matriculation of 13,914 Puerto Rican pupils. In 1956, that figure jumped to over 113,000, exceeding the rate of matriculation in New York of Black American migrant children from the South. Puerto Ricans presented new head-scratching challenges for the schools. Independently of issues of racial discrimination, the Puerto Rican migrants presented a say it again.
Pedological.
Pedagogical. Pedagogical.
Pedagogical.
To challenge administrators, principals, and teachers because they had the dubious distinction of being U.S. citizens who did not speak English. In addition, like earlier migrants, both Puerto Ricans and Black Americans came from small cities or rural settings where the educational systems were underdeveloped and literacy rates lowered. After long, the board and its teachers were challenged with the task of providing instruction to a student population with vastly different needs. At around the same time, during the 1950s and 1960s, the public schools lost to private and did I say that? Yeah. The public schools lost to private and parochial schools approximately the same number of white students that they gained in Puerto Rican and Black student enrollment. Often unacknowledged in public discourse, by 1966, Puerto Ricans made up approximately 20% of the student population in New York. Black American students made up 30%. For the first time in the city's history, over half the student population in New York was Black American and Puerto Rican. This meant that in the era of school reform ushered in by the Brown decision, the fortunes of New York's Puerto Rican and Black American children depended heavily on each other. Among Black American and Puerto Rican parents across the city, the Brown decision signaled the possibility of change in education. The American institution that, even in the face of prejudice and vilification, had historically promised progress and personal redemption. The decision ignited a brushfire of parent activity in support of school reform at local meetings of the Parent Teacher Association, constrained by the association's rules and its bureaucracy by the early 1960s. These activists began to form independent organizations, including the Harlem Parents Committee, the Parents Workshop for Equality, the Citywide Committee for Public Schools, Equal, an organization of white parents who supported school integration, and the United Bronx Parents, led by Evelina Antonetti. Collectively, their newsletters educated the public on educational rights of children. Their meetings and workshops trained parents, especially mothers, to become public speakers, organizers, and negotiators. And their grassroots actions sought to pressure the Board of Education to deliver substantive change. During the same period, a small group of well-organized conservative white parents also launched a movement, one hostile to the project of integration. Along with many white Americans, they believed that their children's educational standards would be depressed if the Brown decision forced their offspring to share the classroom with children they perceived to be incapable of learning. By the late 1950s, once resolute in its condemnation of segregation, the board began to advocate measured consideration of all the options in what it now insisted must be a slow and delicately implemented project in the distant future. As early as 1959, the board began to, quote, encourage integration, unquote, through a busing system that sought to transfer children whenever feasible, quote unquote, from overcrowded schools to under-enrolled ones. A negligible amount of Black American and Puerto Rican students in Brooklyn were actually bused to underpopulated white schools in Queens. Hardly a desegregation mandate, but even that negligible effort sparked fierce protests by white parents. Hundreds kept their children home on the first day of school, and in one instance, 2,000 white parents picketed City Hall. Denise Oliver was one of several young lords who witnessed the fallout. In 1957, with the help of a white proxy, Oliver's middle-class Black American parents purchased a home in Hollis, one of the predominantly white Queens neighborhood, to which children of color were bused in 1959. During her first day at junior high school, 59, Oliver remembers, quote, getting off the bus, commotion going on, and a white kid with blood streaming down his face. There were fights going on in the yard, and there were white students who had jumped some Black students. There were some Black students fighting back. There were white parents protesting the busing of kids in our neighborhood. The bus monitor rushed us into the building. You could feel the hostility immediately, unquote. Ramon Ramirez, a close friend of future Young Lord Chairman Felipe Luciano, had a similar experience in 7th grade when he was bused to Astoria's Steinway Junior High School, JS 141. About 100 Irish Italian people were demonstrating against us. Then you walked into a class through a cordon of police, and if you didn't catch the bus at 3 o'clock, there was always fear that you were going to get caught and white paint would be hurled at us by demonstrators, unquote. The source of white opposition to integration was multi-layered. Stanley Schmiegel, the head of Parents and Taxpayers, the white Queens group that opposed busing, explained the group's goals to the New York Times. Quote, to protect our children, preserve our neighborhood school system, and keep our children from being bused into strange districts, unquote. He went on, quote, I don't have anything against, I'm not going to say that, but the only thing I care about is this. I don't like my child going into class with a lot of slow readers who will put down his IQ, impelled by more blatant prejudice. Others argued that white communities should not take on the burdens of Black Americans who, quote, don't want to work hard enough to get out. Oh my God. To get out of their own environment. Unquote.
Fucking bastard.
All right.
Fucking hate this piece of shit.
The Brown decision signaled too many white parents that integration would disrupt their newly acquired middle class status and their children's progress in school. Parents and taxpayers concerned echoed the world view of generational working class white Americans who were massively relocated to racially exclusive suburbs in the outskirts of the city after World War II through a vast program of government subsidized mortgages. Home ownership and the taste of a good life deepened their racial fears and insular disposition towards quote unquote outsiders. The modest character of their new class standing also made them insecure, fearful of change, and risk averse. Moreover, the changing structure of New York's economy produced anxieties displaced onto people of color, whom were viewed as underserved beneficiaries of the new government policy. Sentiments against segregation were not limited to the white residential sections of the outer boroughs. In a roundtable discussion that aired live on Channel 13's talk show The City, school reform activist and Jewish local worker Ellen Laurie recounted a discussion on the merits of integration in her son's fifth grade class in a school in Washington Heights. According to her son, 2/3 of his classmates indicated that they were, quote, saving their allowances to be able to go to a private school if integration comes into their neighborhood, unquote. However, the experience of Puerto Rican children was not uniform. In search of better housing and schools, some Black American and Puerto Rican families moved into newly built projects in Brooklyn and Queens. The Gonzalez families, for example, moved into Brooklyn's Cypress Hill projects, where their son, future young Lord Juan Gonzalez, enrolled in Franklin K. Lane Public High School. And yes, that's Juan Gonzalez that's on Democracy Now. One of the largest public high schools in the city. Black American and Puerto Rican students from Bronxville and East New York made up approximately 30% of its student body. Although Lane would become the site of the racial strife in the late 1960s and 1970s, the light-skinned Gonzalez did not encounter racial hostilities there in the early 1960s. Rather, he captured the attention of, quote, one of the toughest, most exacting teachers, Pauline Boganara, sure, and was nurtured by her. Boganara was advisor to the school newspaper, and according to Gonzalez, although he didn't realize it at the time, quote, she decided in my freshman year that I was going to be her editor during my senior year, but she wanted me to go through the training process beforehand, unquote. With the guidance of Boganara, Gonzalez enrolled in a junior year summer program for the high school students at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Gonzalez remembers Miss Boganara filled out all the applications, got me the scholarship, then convinced my parents to let me go to Chicago for 6 weeks for this journalism boot camp, unquote. Gonzalez would soon become a key thinker and strategist and one of the most prophetic and lucid writers of his cohort. Future young Lord Gilbert Colon, who enrolled in a predominantly Irish and Italian parochial school in the Bronx, encountered a different fate. In 1958, the Puerto Rican Study Board of Education sponsored an investigation of the educational needs of Puerto Rican children observed a rise in incidences of racial violence immediately outside the school premises. Cologne's after-school rumbles add depth to the report's findings. He observes that the school interaction between boys of color and white girls often precipitated physical hostility on the part of white boys. Cologne's budding friendship with the coterie of white girls whom he participated in a high school play was the source of after-school fights with his white peers. As in the South, Northern white opposition to the Brown decision was fueled by fear that race mixing in the classroom would bleed into the, quote, living room and bedroom as well, unquote. Retrospectively, he observes what he was not able to fully grasp as a teenager. Even though nothing ever happened, was the trigger. There is a fear that a white girl could actually make a male of color, and actually end up going with them. I didn't realize that until a bit later, unquote. As early as 1963, Black American and Puerto Rican parents were calling for immediate improvements in the quality of education of their children and turning for attention to teacher-driven racism in the classroom. These concerns were not new. Black psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who propelled part of the Board of Education's desegregation effort, had spent a lifetime documenting the impact of racism on New York school children and advocating on their behalf. Earlier in the 1930s, Doxy Wilkerson, a professor of education at Howard University, denounced the Board of Education for ensnaring Black children in, quote, America's racial caste system, unquote, for their overconcentration in vocational schools and classes for the mentally challenged, poverty of the facilities that housed their classes, and the effects of the racial contempt they suffered at the hands of guidance, counselors, and teachers, among other findings. The board's own 1950s investigation revealed that majority non-white schools were staffed with inexperienced and ineffective teachers who deemed their students less capable of learning. Despite the volumes of students on the complexity and consequences of racism in the classroom, many teachers and social critics deployed the new sanitized language of northern racism, blaming poor academic performance on alleged quote unquote cultural deficiency of children of color. In the era of Brown, the Board of Education failed to implement a robust, oh god, pedagogical infrastructure for assimilating children of color. It never considered, for example, a public anti-racist campaign to reform the predominantly white and often prejudiced body of public school teachers. In the context of contested change ushered in by the Brown decision and the exponential growth of children of color in public schools, a fierce racist backlash in the classrooms was to be expected. The young lords describe as formative as their early school experiences in an environment that was intimidating and hostile to them. Of his experience, future young lord and Vietnam veteran Felix Velasquez explains, quote, growing up Puerto Rican was just synonymous with dissatisfaction and alienation. I don't know what to call it then. I until I read Paulo, how do I pronounce that? Freire and Franz Fanon on the psychology of oppression, unquote. For his part, Carlito Rivera was one of the youngest members of the Young Lords, was in fourth grade when he heard a substitute teacher call one of his peers beneath her breath a, quote, filthy Puerto Rican, unquote. Carlito described shock. Quote, I was emotionless. There was no emotion. I knew that she used the word Puerto Rican and that my parents had some association with something that was Puerto Rican. I was traumatized because I was too young to fully understand why she said that. But it probably became one of the factors in my radicalization because it was cumulative with other things, unquote. When Carlito attempted in junior high to stand up for his friend Jesse Quinones, who had been ostracized by a teacher, the teacher punched him. Carlito reacted with fury. Quote, I told him I was going to kick his ass, and then I told him I was going to kill him. The next day at the NYPD, New York Police Department, was in the building. They wanted to know what gang I was in, and I was expelled, unquote. Carlito found protection and mentorship in Mr. Calvin, a black teacher at the school to which he was transferred, who encouraged him to join a new group at the school, Students for Freedom. The young Mr. Calvin, who was a member of the Black Panther Party. The ideology that precipitated the aggression against Carlito was echoed in a series of letters penned by white teachers that poured into New York World Telegram in November of 1965. The letters vehemently challenged an editorial written by a black teacher on the racial prejudiced attitudes of her white peers toward her non-white students, using language that today seems startlingly hostile. One letter blamed the culture and low aspirations of Black and Puerto Rican children for the crisis in education. The writer asked whether these children will, quote, ever learn that living by the laws of the jungle is not behavior acceptable in our society, unquote. Wow. This race ideology had been incubated in media representations of Black Americans and Puerto Ricans, but it had also been institutionalized in educational studies and policies of the New York public schools. In 1935, a study of children in East Harlem conducted by eugenicist psychologists, and sponsored by New York State, concluded that the majority of Puerto Rican children were incapable of learning due to innate mental inferiority. Wow. Not surprisingly, when the Board of Education established after World War II, its so-called 600 schools for the quote unquote emotionally disturbed Puerto Ricans, like Black Americans, were overrepresented in them. By the 1950s, however, social scientists began to adopt new analytical frameworks to explain social problems and achievement differentials between white students and students of color. The new analyses identified poverty, social isolation, poor schooling, and racism, among other structural factors, rather than genetics as the root cause. But in 1959, when anthropologist Oscar Lewis coined the term "quote unquote" culture of poverty in his study of Mexican families, social scientists began to elevate analyses of the culture produced by poverty over analyses of racism and poverty's cultural causes. The vagueness of the term also allowed for its adaptation by a cross section of political currents on the right and among liberals, which both of which now agreed to varying degrees that social problems among people of color were the product of dysfunctional cultural behavior within families and communities. Racial bigotry against Puerto Rican children in the classroom was compounded by language discrimination for Puerto Ricans on the mainland. The stigma attached to Spanish language was an extension of the politics of language in Puerto Rico, where from the time of the United States took control in 1898 until the late 1940s, English became the official language of the island's political system and the compulsory language of instruction in public schools. Young Lord David Perez spoke to the psychological consequences of this struggle over language on the mainland. Quote, language becomes a reward and a punishment system. In the school system here, if you don't quickly begin to speak English and shed your Puerto Rican values, you're put back a grade. You're treated as if you're, wait, we don't say that word anymore. And you own cultural values, therefore are shown to be of less value than the cultural values of this country and the language of this country. It creates a monetized mentality and a strong feeling of inferiority, of not being as worthy as the other Americans, unquote. Perez grew up in Puerto Rico until the age of 10, where he then came to Chicago to live with his mother despite his academic interests. Perez was tracked in a vocational school. Oh my goodness. These pedagogical concerns began to take center stage in New York when parents organized a citywide boycott of public schools on February 3rd, 1964, when over 464,000 students, almost half of the student body, stayed out of school. Although the boycott was intended to challenge the Board of Education's stalling tactics on the question of integration, the complex and gargantuan effort before the protesters of providing alternative instruction during the student boycott gave birth to a new facet of the movement. According to Johanna Fernandez, organizing for one day what the New York school reform movement called quote unquote liberation schools was a quote arduous uphill effort, organizing effort unquote, that opened up a universe of political questioning because they challenged organizers to think creatively about what a day of teaching would be like. Garena Valentine continues, quote, we had now gone past an abstract intellectual question. Now we were tackling the meat and potatoes, if you will, of a Black community intent on learning about who W.E. Du Bois and Paul Robeson were. What was slavery all about, and who were the responsible parties, and what exactly happened during the Civil War. And Puerto Ricans were asked who Don Pedro Albizu Campos was. and the struggle of the liberators for liberation. And what about the invasion of Puerto Rico by the United States, unquote. As we will see, the Young Lords would extend this approach and radical perspective to a much larger cohort of young activists by their generation by taking these efforts to radically rethink the education to the streets. By the mid 1960s, school integration failed in New York. According to the 1965 pamphlet prepared by the Harlem Parents Committee, quote, despite the optimism of the Commission on Integration, an optimism shared by many of us at the time, now, after 7 years of studies and surveys, new programs and pilot programs, we find ourselves essentially no further along the road in the fall of the 1965 than we did in the fall of 1958, unquote. Frustrated with the Board of Education stalling tactic, Black American and Puerto Rican parent organizers reoriented their goals away from integration. The activists now argue that the local communities should play a role in curricular development and the hiring and firing of administrators and teachers, challenging the exclusive power over education held by the Board of Education and the United Federation of Teachers. The new political current now called itself the Movement to Decentralize the Public Schools. It emerged alongside the actions of young people radicalized by the Black Power movement who began to defend their rights in schools. The second half of the 1960s, junior high and high school students in New York organized around issues of freedom of free speech and the imposition of dress codes and absence of structure within which to articulate their grievances, points of view, and altercations with teachers. The articles they published in independent student newsletters and lawsuits filed by some students against the Board of Education emphasized the violation of their constitutional rights. Many students, like Iris Morales, were also critical of the elitist and racist structure of school tracking. Studies discovered that these students were critical of the school's focus on tests over, quote, value of the educational process, unquote, and noted that the, quote, high achiever is often disenchanted with his curriculum as the low achiever, not wanting to be sealed off academically from the rest of his class. He is often resentful of being pressured into honors classes, unquote. It was in this cauldron of constant contestation over the rights of young people of color that those who later became Young Lords and Black Panthers were politicized. The backlash to student protests in the school was swift. A secret memo by the Association of High School Principals outlined outlined the problem from the perspective of administrators, observing that, quote, contemporary student movements are a battering ram to test and then destroy the establishment, unquote. Written by liberal administrators, the memo upheld what it called the great libertarian tradition, unquote, for a freedom of free speech and quote unquote responsible dissent, but recommend repression, calling on principals to quote unquote outline the limits of permissible dissent and to quote unquote exercise courage in limiting process that quote unquote social disorientation. Included among these were those protests that constituted an attack on the viability of a school using their peripheral issues, non-negotiable demands, and calculated disorder to wrest control from lawful authorities. The nature of the demands, manifestos, and political platforms, position papers, and the manner of their presentation allow not only one response: denial, simple, clear, and unequivocal. Discussion, perhaps. Negotiation, no. Security guards were brought into public schools for the first time in March of 1969 to bring heel to protests led by, oh wow, I didn't know that. To bring heel to protests led by students of color, the new demographic majority in the public schools. Students who clashed with their teachers or administrators were rejected by these security guards, often with police backup. The implementation of law and order practices and introduction of quote-unquote para-police methods in the schools led to more suspensions and expulsions of Black American and Puerto Rican students. Shortly before she joined the Young Lords, Denise Oliver taught Black American and Puerto Rican history at East Harlem Prep, an East Harlem school launched by RGS that offered an educational space to this new class of young people permanently expelled from the public school system. After having been expelled for her activism at Howard University, Oliver was startled by her success with what the school system perceived as, quote, unincorrigible students. A lot of the kids in the community weren't into school at all. They were considered to be refused, unteachable, unreachable. A lot of them were in gangs, unquote. She too read Cha-Cha's interview during the East Harlem gathering of students searching for a political agenda in June 1969. In New York, the struggles in the schools had moved public discourse on solutions to the crisis in education beyond a narrowly conceived integration project. The discourse challenged pedagogy, pedagogy, I don't know, and elevated the project of education to the goal of personal emancipation and community uplift, a kind of antidote to racist instructions in the schools. The Board of Education's failure to implement integration had also paved the way for the argument among people of color that change would only be achieved through their control of community institutions. The young people who launched the Young Lords in New York would be influenced by their own experiences with racism in the classroom and by the politics bequeathed to them by the struggles for school reform in New York. Ooh, that was a lot.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Yeah, some of these chapters are pretty long. Appreciate you though, Alyssa.
Yo, that was awesome.
Absolutely. So yeah, this chapter right here, our subsection dealt with the Board of Education when they were trying to integrate us into these colonial schools that we often talk about all the time. And I think we have had a lot of discussion about like the school system, what roles they really play, and just watching these efforts to integrate us, really assimilate us into these colonial schools, shows why like we emphasize the need to eventually within our movement build liberation schools that's going to actually not only teach our history, but to bring us a form of education that's going to give us a class analysis of the problems and solutions in this country, which to this day has never done. You know what I'm saying? A lot of us don't find out about movements like the Young Lords or even what Martin Luther King really stood for. You dig what I'm saying? And not the 1963 Martin Luther King, but the 1968 Martin Luther King that was pushing the Poor People's Campaign and was taking a class analysis of this system. Even him himself, he said that he think he made a mistake, that he integrated us into a burning building. You know what I mean?
That's what he said.
Yeah, so this is a good point. I think this is going to be a good discussion with a lot of the comrades on here. I like to go into what was the effect of colonial schools on you growing up in the United States in this generation, all the way back to when Che was in school. You did what I'm saying? What was some of the colonial effects that you saw in yourself? I'll start off by saying, and I know a lot of us read my autobiography. I remember how disconnected I was whenever they talked about history, especially around slavery and stuff like that, and how it's like, dang, so it's like we only were slaves. Like I used to believe that for the longest. I was like, damn, Black people don't even have no history. You know what I'm saying? We was only slaves and stuff like that. And that was the type of impression they wanted to leave on us. And even the Civil War, they try to make it seem like it was due to Northern whites wanting to end slavery for us, because this was the like this was the right and moral thing to do. They even made Abraham Lincoln out to be somebody that was like a Martin Luther King. You know what I mean? And then you find out later on, like, this dude has so many white supremacist views and values and stuff like that. Like, he didn't believe in integration. He did, well, not integration. He didn't believe in like intermarrying. He didn't believe in us sitting on juries convicting white people. He even said himself that if there's going to be a position of inferiority and superiority, it would definitely be assigned to the white race. Like, this is Abraham Lincoln, the person they made us believe was all about he loved black people and he wanted the best for black people and stuff like that. Then we find out the complete opposite. This dude was a white supremacist just like all the rest of them. The only difference, he was a capitalist. You know what I mean? And supported the industrialization of the United States. But yeah, I like to go around the room, you know, and hear from some of the comrades. I know some of this is probably rehashing stuff that we went over before, we discussed before, but I like to start with Gabby. Like, what was your colonial education like, and how did that affect you here?
Well, honestly, if I'm gonna be completely honest, I have very bad memory. You know, like I have bad memory, but for the most part, you know, I was always educated on how America was this pinnacle of liberation. You know, and exactly as you said, how Abraham Lincoln, you know, how Abraham Lincoln, you know, what we want to quote unquote free the slaves, the great emancipator, quote unquote, how the United States was founding, how the United States was founded on quote unquote, you know, supposedly freedom and you know, and rights and shit like that. But you know, I always saw around me, and I always knew that wasn't true. You know, like I didn't know it back then, but like I always just kind of like I always just knew that something wasn't up. You know, with the shit that was being taught. You know, I was just observing the world and the shit in it, and there was something there that just wasn't clicking with me. You know, like I knew there was something there, I just didn't know what it was. But after I became a Marxist, and after I started to after I started to see things through a scientific and dialectical analysis, now I start to understand why things are the way they are. You know, like the true history of the United States and the true history of the world about colonialism and imperialism and so on and so forth. A large part of my education, you know, with being in Florida was kind of about, you know, the civil rights, and you know, and the Civil War. You know, they portrayed it as, you know, how the South wasn't fighting, how you know, that the whole bullshit about how Southern states were fighting for their quote unquote rights. That fucking bullshit. But yeah, it just left a feeling of disconnection, kind of like you know, like I like you know, like it just didn't make sense to me, the stuff that I was learning about versus what I was seeing around the world. And this shit that they're talking about in the book kind of exemplifies how even though they were trying to integrate or assimilate, as you were saying, it's these colonized people in the schools, how they were still being oppressed, and B, even though they were trying to quote unquote integrate them, they still had worse schooling experiences. They had worse schools compared to white neighborhoods, and how overall they were being taught the same white supremacist racist bullshit, and and instilling them with this feeling of inferiority, you know, this internalized racism, like they were talking about, you know. So it's really fascinating, and yeah, you're muted, Comrade Kwame. You're muted.
Right on, right on. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's a big paradox. It's a big irony. You know what I'm saying? Of what they proclaim to be, what they miseducated us in believing what this country is about, versus what we know it to be true today. You know what I mean? And like the effects it had on us, like it really gave I think a lot of us, especially colonized people, inferiority complexes and stuff. You know what I'm saying? Where a lot of us didn't even like, we had a disconnected the disconnection with where like our origins. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of Black people didn't want to talk about Africa or them look at themselves as relating to Africa. I remember earlier in this book, it was talking about Cha-Cha, how he didn't talk about Puerto Rico and he didn't relate to Puerto Rico and didn't identify with Puerto Rico, didn't want to talk about Puerto Rico until he was sent down to Puerto Rico, and he started to really identify with the Puerto Rican culture and his nationality, and then start to realize the colonial status that the Puerto Rico country in relation to the United States was. That was like his politicization. You know what I'm saying? And this is the part of the disconnect. Like you being Cuban, the way that Cuba is talked about. You know what I'm saying? It would make yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no. I was gonna say I remember now. You know, so obviously, you know, being in Florida, there's a lot of bullshit about Cuba. You know, a lot of my education, a lot of the shit that I was surrounded by was always talking about how, you know, about how Cuba, how bad Cuba is, how Castro and Che fucking murdered billions of people, how they made Cuba worse. I specifically remember this situation, right? Exactly what you were talking about, where I was in this class in my what was it, in my middle school, right? And they were teaching us about Cuba, and they're talking about Castro and how many brothers he had. And this girl, all of a sudden, in the middle of the class, she started fucking screaming and crying, and she fucking started like saying, and she started saying shit like, "Why did God give Castro so many brothers? Why is Cuba and why are Cubans, you know, going through so much pain?" And that shit kind of like it just kind of like shocked me, you know, like it's like genuinely saddening seeing that here, you know, seeing Cubans feeling bad about their culture and about where they fucking come from. And you know, that's the shit that a lot of diaspora from countries face. You know, they fucking they're instilled this feeling of, you know, of feeling bad about where they come from, especially if their country has a communist history, you know, and that shit right there kind of woke me up. So yeah.
No doubt, no doubt. It's like we all have this common experience. You know what I mean? That's why they don't like us doing what we're doing. That's why they don't like the first Rainbow Coalition and don't like the second Rainbow Coalition, because now we actually have conversations and we find out we have a lot in common. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Che, like how did that colonial education affect you in your relationship to how you view Puerto Rico, and how a lot of like your family and stuff, like how did they look at that? You know what I'm saying? Versus you know, like being here in the United States and the assimilation process, like how did that affect you and a lot of people in your community?
Before I begin, let me say that in 1898, Spain gave us somewhat partial liberty to build our island, you know, and we was in the process of being independent when all of a sudden out of the blue sky the devil came and took it. You know, the United States. they walked right into to the island and started saying that they were there to free us from Spain when Spain already had given us freedom. So that was ridiculous. The speaking of Spanish, the speaking of English in school, let me say this to y'all because y'all may not even know it. It was a law that was passed that Puerto Ricans on the island was not supposed to speak Spanish whatsoever, but to speak English. And anybody who spoke English, Spanish would be punished. Grown-ups, if they spoke Spanish, they'll go to jail. There was a lot of National Party people that went to jail as a result of speaking Spanish. In our own land, we couldn't speak Spanish. So that's colonialism right there. Now, with me, my education, I'm gonna tell you, my education came late in life, like in the 40s, because I left school at a very young age. Why did I leave school? Because I had problems. First of all, my mother's Jamaican, she's Black. And my father was brownish, he was brown complexion. And so when students used to see me, my mother taking me to school, they would call me all types of names. Really all kinds of, I don't even want to name them, but they called me all kinds of names. And that forced me to leave school. And as a result of leaving school, I was living in the neighborhood that was Irish and Italian and Jewish and African Americans. But nevertheless, I was always getting these status from the neighborhood, especially with the Italians, because they'll see me and my mother and they will go off verbally, So I was when it came to a period in the summer, I would go to Puerto Rico to get away from the madness. But I would go over there and only get more madness. You know why? Because Puerto Ricans would look at me over there, and being that I wasn't born there, they would call me an American. That was crazy. I used to have fights in Puerto Rico, man, with my own people because he used to call me an American because I came from the United States, and that was crazy, And so when I used to be in New York, I had to join a gang in order to be able to survive. So when I hear Cha-Cha would talk about the Young Laws when he first was a gang, yeah, I was also part of a gang very early in life. Colonialism forced me to be part of the gang in order to protect myself from Irish, not Jews, because Jews were, but Irish and Italians, because they had Irish and Italian gangs right in the neighborhood, So I always had problems with that, So when I came to get my education when I was like in my 42, 43, I was in social service, and for a minute, and they gave me the opportunity of going to school. So I went back to school, and in the process of that, they paid for my associate's degree, and then I just had to, then I started working, and then I paid for my bachelor's degree. So that's how I was able to get my school. But other than that, when I was a kid, the neighborhood was rough. I could not go to school. At least not me anyway. I couldn't. I had a lot of, I was beat up a few times. I also beat up some kids myself, but there was a lot of static. And my mother had a lot of problems too, because being Jamaican, she worked in the factory, and she had a lot of shit that came down on her in the factory, so she was getting it from not only the factory, but also the neighborhood. And I was getting it from the neighborhood. And when I go to Puerto Rico, I get it over there too. So either way, I was getting.
Did you ever wrestle with being Puerto Rican, as an identity? Like I said, with me being Black, I remember growing up with an inferiority complex that came from like the educational system, how I internalized a lot of the self-hate that they was implicitly and explicitly directing at us. You know what I'm saying? Like we did, like I said,
Yeah.
I didn't even feel like we had a history. You know what I mean? Like we was just
Yeah,
slaves and
yeah.
that's it. We was
Well,
savages.
I didn't have that problem. I didn't have that problem because when I went to Puerto Rico, my grandfather, you know, he was Jamaican, but he lived in Puerto Rico, and he learned the language, he learned the culture, he learned everything about Puerto Rican history. And then he used to tell me also, he said, "You Puerto Rican." You know, my mother used to tell me, "You Puerto Rican, don't ever forget that." So I grew up with knowing that I was Puerto Rican. But going to the island was a different thing, because when I go to the island, they say, "What are you?" "I'm Puerto Rican." "No, you're not. Were you born here?" "No, you're not Puerto Rican." And that was crazy. But that was part of the injection of the United States, injected that into the island, because a lot of Puerto Ricans, if they didn't speak English, they get chastised, you know. So I mean, I don't know, man.
Did you see that in other Puerto Ricans? Like they wrestle with their identity, having a pride within their culture and stuff like that. At times wanted to identify more with America and Western values and stuff like that. Did you see some of that?
I was growing up, man, with this with this Cuban young kid, man, and he was Cuban, and he believed, and he said he was Cuban, but in his household they were telling him that he wasn't Cuban, that he was an American, only because of the invasion of in Cuba with Castro, you know. And I'm like 1959 when I grew up with this Cuban brother, man, and he had a lot of problems in the family because people in his family will reject him and deny him the fact that he was Cuban. They were saying that he's American only because he was born here, but he believed he was a Cuban. Yeah, I had friends. I had a lot of Puerto Rican friends that unfortunately, I will say, you know, did not see themselves as Puerto Ricans. You know, they saw themselves as Americans, because America has a tendency in Puerto Rico telling us that we are Americans and we're not Puerto Ricans. You know, and that's been there's been a war going on with that for a long time. You know, trying to deprive us of our culture. You know, I mean, I don't know.
No doubt. I see Gabby has her hand raised.
Comrade Trey, I wanted to comment on what you said because growing up, I experienced that a little bit as well, because I was born in Cuba, right? Like I was actually born in Cuba. I was born in the Matanza province in the city of Colon, but I was only there for 1 year because my parents took me from Cuba. They took me from Cuba when I was just 1, and they took me to the United States. And I basically lived here for most of my life, you know. And even though I was born in Cuba, I'd had people tell me, "Oh, you're not Cuban. You're American. You know, you're more from Miami than you are from Cuba." And that would always kind of like hurt me a little bit, you know, because like, no, I am Cuban. You know, I may have been taken away from Cuba by my parents, but that doesn't mean I'm not Cuban, you know. So whenever I had people telling me, you know, I wasn't Cuban, it would always kind of hurt me. It wasn't as extreme as what you are explaining, but yeah, I experienced people trying to tell me what my identity was, and saying I wasn't Cuban. I'm more American than Cuban and shit like that. So yeah.
Absolutely. I want to bring Johnny Torres into this discussion. Him living down in Texas and stuff like that. Like, how did that colonial education affect you? Like, I used to hear about the Alamo. I didn't even know what the Alamo was for a long. Remember the Alamo? Like, I didn't know the significance of that. You didn't want to say I didn't know the relationship of Mexico with a lot of the land over here was Mexican land, and it was taken from them during the Mexican-American War. You didn't want to say where they basically took their land to spread slavery down in Texas and all kind of stuff. Like how did that affect you growing up?
It did affect me a little bit because, you know, when I went to elementary in the 90s, you know, we're all, you know, they all tell everyone these lies about, of course, the Alamo. Like you said, Abraham Lincoln, they wanted to paint this portrait that he, you know, that he is like, you know, like Martin Luther King in disguise, you know, that he was all holy, and among other people, you know, and it did kind of affect us in a way. A little as we went on, I would probably say maybe fifth grade when you kind of got a little smarter on things. You're like, something don't seem right. They're like they're painting this picture of all these false heroes, you know, and they're most of them are all white. They barely wanted to shine any kinds of glorification on anything that any, you know, colored people have done. They, of course, they did talk about, the only person I remember they talked about was Martin Luther King. That's it. They didn't talk about nothing else. Nobody else. Yeah, they didn't want to talk about Malcolm X. Nobody. You know, they just stuck it to Martin Luther King. That was it. But they didn't want to talk about other things that he did. Just, you know, the little bit of basic stuff that everyone kind of already knows. But, you know, as time did go on, you kind of noticed everything was kind of a sham. Definitely the Alamo and all these heroes that were there, all these, you know, Davy Crockett and all of them, they weren't really heroes. They were just, you know, they're killing everybody, you know. But it's best that we understand all this now. I mean, we got the knowledge that we do know. Probably like in sixth grade, we knew everything was a lie from then. When we got a little older, I'm like, hey man, everything they told us was all a lie. There was probably 10% of it was true and the rest was all lies, you know. But we caught on and we definitely learned from it. And we definitely do tell, like, you know, our nieces or nephews, you know, don't buy in whatever they tell you, you know, get to know your history. And I guess that's why we're doing what we do. And we're like spreading the knowledge. We're, you know, making books and whatnot about our, you know, revolutionary history. So it's good that we're definitely, you know, picking up off where our ancestors left off and our revolutionary heroes left off, because they try to, you know, bury all these people. They never wanted to bring them up for anything, but it's good that we're bringing them up. And I feel like that's what really bothered me back in the day, but it doesn't really bother me now because I feel like people are starting to wake up in a sense that, you know, don't believe everything the school especially tells you, you know, because it does start off in the early ages and how they brainwash you. And, you know, then when you start growing up, you kind of realize what's right and who was, you know, the real heroes. You know, it was our people. They were the real heroes. You know, they're the ones that made the sacrifices, and, you know, now we're picking up where they left off.
Did you ever struggle with like inferiority complex or anything like that growing up in attending them schools and stuff, and like how they related to Mexicans and versus white Americans and stuff like that? Did you ever struggle with that growing up?
Very, very little. There was, especially in elementary, not really in middle school. I guess when I got older, I kind of calmed down, but it was more in elementary where you did kind of see some of the white kids were getting a little bit more privileged things. Some of these kids were on honor roll. I don't even know how that even happened. You know, a lot of little things that I did notice, but, you know, especially like a little discrimination here and there. But I guess at times when we did bring it up to the principals or the other teachers, no one seemed to do anything about it. They were just kind of like, you know, oh, it's nothing, it's not a big deal, you know, trying to tell us it was nothing. But we all knew it was something going on with the schools, but it didn't go as bad as, you know, as other people would tell me about their schools in Houston. It was pretty bad, and I guess how their discrimination was, and there was just a lot of, I don't know, I guess because it was more of a majority of, I guess, white kids, and there was barely any colored kids. So it's like, but my school, it was barely anything like that. But it seemed like nobody wanted to do nothing about it. I can't hear
Okay.
nothing. Okay.
I appreciate that, comrade. I want to hear from Alyssa. Like how did attending those colonial schools being white, like how did that affect you? Like what type of impressions did it leave? Like did you feel like me, like black people didn't have no history, but we was just slaves and stuff? Like how did you internalize a lot of the colonial education that you was being taught? And how did it make you look at the like your relationship to other people as how they were trying to explain history and stuff?
Hmm. Well, I think that most of my like actual realizations have definitely come later in life because I think that the era that I grew up, like me and Johnny are pretty close in age, I believe. So like I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s where like everybody listened to hip hop and all that kind of stuff and everybody like was friends with everybody. I would say that that most of the racism was like Islamophobia when I was growing up. But I do remember I went to Catholic school up until 6th grade, and even as a white girl, well, actually, I can't. Recently, I've realized that I don't think that I ever had one black teacher, ever. I cannot think of one. Um, I can't even like place one in a single school that I've ever gone to be completely honest. Um, so that I've come to that realization recently as well. But when I was in 4th grade, one of the like everybody always says, we watched, movies about, Martin Luther King Jr. or whatever. And that was really it. But we were watching this movie and I think it was about Bloody Sunday, but I can never find the movie and I talk about it all the time. But I remember hearing just the foul language that the white people were saying about, the black people and stuff like that. And remembering that language coming out of my own family's mouth at a certain point. And that has stuck in my brain since I was like, I don't know, what are you, 9 when you're in 4th grade, something like that. Because I was so mad at that movie and I was so mad that there wasn't any more white people doing the right thing. And then remembering that I had heard that coming out of my own family's mouth made me I think that's what I grew up like kind of obsessed with Martin Luther King Jr. because he's really the only one that I knew about. And the Holocaust because that was also the only thing that we were taught about. But then come to find out that's just like all over the place, but we're only taught about the white version of that. Granted, it was obviously a terrible, terrible thing that happened. But I think that no matter what, in some way, shape, or form, like there's always a way for you not to fit in schools around here. Like they're not. In the Catholic school, like you had to, you wear the uniforms and this, that, and the other thing. And I would always get in trouble. Like you get in trouble for even wearing nail polish. You get your nail polish taken off by your principal and stuff like that. You're not allowed to have like any type of individuality. And they don't necessarily. Now I think it's a little bit more lenient. It's been a long time since I've been in school, but I think that that's kind of what it's and not kind of what they do. That's obviously that's what we've learned is their intention is just to create like a factory worker out of you, right? Like they just want you to be, I don't know, you might as well be in a uniform in every school. And it's interesting that even still to this day, most of the time, the people that have to wear uniforms are inner city schools.
Right. What did you think about like before black people came over as slaves? Like what did you from how they instilled in us implicitly in them colonial schools? What did you think our history was like? Like what did you think like that we had contributed anything to history or anything the way they taught in schools and stuff?
No, I think, well, specifically to Black history, no, I don't think that they expanded upon anything at all. They basically said, you know, yeah, we brought these people over here. It was kind of shitty. They were all right. We let them go, whatever, moving on. But I think that overall, like, now that I'm trying to educate myself rather than just like getting through school and stuff like that, like everything was just American history. You know what I mean? There was no like 1492. You know what I mean? That shit didn't exist. Like the world started in 1776 is the kind of, you know what I mean? Like that's just kind of the education that I feel like we get here. Or at least I did anyway.
Right, yeah. That's one of the things that's fucked me up when I started reading like African history and like reading about the Mali Empire, Ghana Empire, Songhai Empire. And then I started to find out, I was like, damn, that our people had universities and shit. You know what I'm saying? Like that surprised the fuck out of me because I was like, damn, I thought we was just like heathens and savages that lived in the bush and stuff. And you know what I mean? Like my whole impression of African history was so distorted that like I literally like believed a lot of the bullshit that they used to put out. Like we was just savages and stuff, and like they came over here and civilized us and stuff. And then I find out these my African ancestors is reading Plato and Socrates, and they're translating this and teaching Europeans, and they're going to their universities and stuff. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, why we ain't know about this type of shit? You know what I'm saying? Like they was doing cataract surgeries and stuff on people's eyes and some of their hospitals and stuff like that. Timbuktu, when I learned about Timbuktu and how Timbuktu was like a very big cultural center that people across the world went to. You know what I'm saying? I was like, damn. And that's when like the veil will start to be started to lift from my eyes fully. And I started to really take on a real pride of who I was, what people I came from, their contributions to human civilization. But I agree with you. I think like these colonial schools, they don't talk about nothing but American history, and even that's distorted. But because it's silent on a lot of other people's history, you get the impression that the only history that mattered, that actually contributed, was American and white history and stuff, that every other history was irrelevant. You know what I'm saying? But then I started studying all the other people around the world, and I was like, dang, you know, the Mexicans have contributed a lot to civilization. The Chinese has contributed a lot to human civilization, and built actual like civilizations that lasted for a long time, that people used to go and learn different things, pass that knowledge back to their cultures when they went back to their cultures. And that's when I started to realize like it's a lot of stuff they left out. It's a whole lot. And this is another reason why we in the Second Rainbow Coalition talk about all of our different cultures, because it's like we to understand the contributions that we've all contributed over the years, especially in this class struggles. It helped us identify and see the common points of unity and why we as oppressed people have a lot more in common, and freeing ourselves from white supremacist views and stuff is essential to us being able to work with other oppressed people and appreciating their culture and appreciating their contributions, appreciating their historical heroes and sheroes that fought for our liberation. You know what I mean? So that's something we're gonna always continue within this movement, is to learn what we're not told, the stuff they were silent about. You know what I mean? Joe Gonzalez, did you want to jump in here, and Rob, before we close this out? Did y'all have anything that y'all wanted to say about this chapter?
I'm available, and I jumped in a little late, so my apologies. But I always like coming, yeah, even if I just caught the last few minutes of or a few pages of the reading. So I can't really talk about that, but I think the question you were talking about is how did colonialistic or colonialism in the schools affect us as individuals? And I wanted to take it back a little farther. With my grandparents, they weren't able to go to school because there was no schools that really accepted Mexican, and we're talking about in Texas. My grandfather in the middle of Texas. My grandmother in El Paso was able to go to school, but she only went to the 6th grade because it wasn't for Mexicanos at that time. Of course, it wasn't until the 60s that the late 60s, they started fighting. Oh, even before that, they've been fighting it since like the 40s and 50s. But in the late 60s, they were able to actually make change in the schools. Now we go on to my parents. My parents were in the East LA walkouts and in the late 60s, 68, 69, I believe 69 or 68.
Yeah, with the brown berets, right?
Yes,
Walk out.
correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
I watched that movie. Yeah.
Oh, so my parents did that, but prior to them doing that, and that's after the walkouts, they didn't even go back to school. So neither one of my parents went back to school. And of course, now we're talking about 1970 when I'm born. They didn't go that they after 69, they didn't go back to school. All right, then I start kindergarten and at 5 years old, and it was pretty cool because I had a really cool teacher. Taught us gardening, taught us all kinds of different things. You know, I mean, at such an early age. So I was like, oh wow, school's gonna be good. But by the time I got to 1st grade, I had an older female Black teacher that just didn't like me. She was always putting me under her desk, like humiliating me, kicking me down there. And one time she kicked me and I reacted and my hand flew up. And then she went complaining, taking me to the office saying I was touching her leg. I was like, oh man, my dad found out about that and they didn't fire that teacher. They just changed classes. Then I only had white teachers after that. And going on through grade school, they wanted to put me in speech all the time since like I was in 1st grade. Like speech, like I didn't even speak Spanish at the time. Get that. Now we go on to let's say 5th and 6th grade. I start reading books and I start preparing myself to go to junior high. I go in 5th grade. They wanted to put me in English as a 2nd language class because my parents moved out to middle suburbia, so I was out of the neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, I was getting straight A's, and by the time they take me out to middle suburbia, I'm getting straight F's. And there was different books, a different curriculum, and so I struggled. And let's be mindful, when I went to grade school, they were still swatting kids. So it was always like a threat, like you're going to get swatted. That's if your parents sign. My dad says, I'm not signing for that. Is anybody going to swat this boy? It's going to be me. And that's the way that went on. Now, when I get to junior high, I have a hard time all through school because I was Chicano, and like Che had mentioned earlier, and where you couldn't assimilate it because the Mexicanos didn't like you and the Americans didn't like you. So you were like stuck as a whole separate Aslan nation, a different entity from families that were here prior to the United States acquiring this land, even before the Spaniards. So it made it hard. So I'll hurry up so I don't talk too much. But I wanted to say, by the time I went to 9th grade, I was there 1 month. I had a white English teacher. She had us make 2 book reports. And in those 2 book reports, I chose Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee about the 1873 massacre. And I also wrote a report on Yo Soy Joaquin, or I Am Joaquin, by Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. If y'all haven't checked that out, it's pretty good. And it really breaks down the history of what it is to be a Chicano. And I get kicked out of school. After I made those reports, the teacher had it in for me. That following Monday, I'm speaking Spanish outside. I had learned to speak Spanish by then. I'm speaking Spanish in front of my classroom to some homegirls, and the teacher comes out of the classroom all pissed off, grabs me by the ear, and tries to take me to the principal's office. I snatch my ear away from her, but I walked with her to the principal's office, and they expelled me from school because she said I was making terrorist threats towards her. And I got expelled from school from a Chicano principal. Imagine that. They just didn't like us East LA kids. They called us cholos. They called us all kinds of damn things. That was just our ethnic roots, the way we were brought up. So it wasn't a gang thing. It got like, after a while, it went into a gang thing, like sagging pants and white t-shirts and Dickies and whatnot. That was a working man's work, clothes. It wasn't a gang thing at first. But anyway, so schools have been really, really bad, but they've made a lot of advancements, not as much as it should be right now, but there is a lot of advancements where a lot of us people of different ethnicities have gone on to be high school teachers, have gone on to be professors, and have their doctorates. And that's powerful. So what has started off like in the early 30s and 40s, trying to get Mexican kids to even have a school for themselves, or Chicano kids, should I say, to where, and a lot of them were farm workers. So like out on the farm, there ain't no damn school out there unless somebody took the time to teach something.
Mm-hmm.
What they would call later on is one-room schoolrooms.
Yeah, I heard about that.
It was from kindergarten to 12th grade.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah.
So, but anyway, I don't want to say too much more, but other than I appreciate learning, and I appreciate coming on to these study groups and stuff like that, because ever since then, and I've always tried to educate myself, and I'm still doing that. So all power to the people.
All power to the people. Rob, we'll let you be the last one, and we'll bring this to a conclusion. Would you like to say anything about this chapter, Rob Strong? If you're talking, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Rob Strong.
You may not be there.
Okay. All right. Well, as always, man, it's always a pleasure doing these book readings with all the comrades. I appreciate everybody coming on, sharing your thoughts, your life experiences, because I think this is a big in helping us learn from each other and see that you wasn't alone. You know, a lot of us had wrestled with a lot of different stuff going through these colonial schools and the discrimination and the stuff that came out of that. You know what I'm saying? So you understand, like, why we push, again, political education, why we be pushing like the need for us to eventually have our own liberation schools and stuff like that, and why, you know, developing these intercommunalist relationships of people, oppressed people coming together, fighting back against a common enemy is essential. You dig what I'm saying? It's absolutely fundamental to the struggle. So yeah, I appreciate y'all coming on. I know this Sunday again, Gabby will be leading a discussion for the next book reading of this book, The Young Lords. So definitely tune in. That's 2 p.m. Eastern time. So if y'all want to jump on there with Gabby, definitely try to last time. I think
Yeah,
Gabby
no one
was the
came.
only one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no one came, man. That was really sad, not gonna lie. Like I'm like, why
yeah.
is no one
So
coming?
yeah, definitely come on, support Gabby. Hopefully you got it all rectified with some of the other moderators that's gonna be on there with you, Gabby. So even your moderators be there to be there to support the discussion and the reading with you. But anyway, all you comrades, I love y'all, man. Y'all have a good night. I'm about to finally lay down again and get some rest.
You know what? Before 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 he closes, I want to end this with a quote from Lenin, if that's okay with y'all.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. I just wanted to read this quote from Lenin. I must say that the tasks of the youth in general and of the young communist leagues and all other organizations in particular might be summed up in a single word: learn. You know, right on.
Absolutely.
Because knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
Knowledge is power. And with that, all power to the people.
All power to the people, comrades.
Revolutionary love, comrades.
Absolutely. Have a good night.
Have a good night.